All right, welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, is Phil McKenzie, and we are here talking to you today about yet another upcoming UFC card. And this, like the one after it, in fact, I think if you go back and listen to last week's episode, you will hear us, surprise, surprise, complaining about this fact. This and UFC 250, which is slated for next week, both did not look like they were going to come together. I do find myself quite impressed. I have to wonder, I don't know, what sort of backdoor methods were employed to actually get something resembling a full UFC card scheduled. But we have here 11 fights. And yesterday we had 12. Just yesterday, Phil. I'm getting emotional thinking about it. But Kevin Holland...
Yeah.
You tell him. I can't.
Kevin Holland was going to be on this card, fighting at welterweight, and now he isn't anymore, and we are bereft.
We are bereft. That's a very English way of saying, yeah, I'm sad. We are bereft. It's an okay card. I guess the theme up front is that many of these fights we're going to talk about are, while in one way or another interesting and meaningful as matchups, many of them do not seem cut out to be actually fun or interesting to watch. Maybe interesting. I just want you to sort of mute your expectations. Then you'll either be pleasantly surprised or you will exist merely on the level of interested. Because what we're going to cover, all right, brace yourselves, what we're going to cover on today's episode, the main event, Tyron Woodley, famed action fighter, versus Gilbert Burns. The co-main event, Blagoy Ivanov versus Augusto Sakai, a heavyweight fight, but also not like one of the really punchy sort of heavyweight fights. So we're probably looking at a 3-round decision there. And I've probably just jinxed it to be an Ngannou-style 20-second sprinting KO. Mackenzie Dern versus Hannah Cifers we're going to talk about, which probably is going to have some action, although may not. Depends on how easily Mackenzie Dern wins that one. Caitlin Chookagian, who lost to Valentina Shevchenko in her last fight. A result which, Phil, it had completely disappeared from your mind. I had to remind you that Chookagian lost to Valentina Shevchenko. Well, never you fear, because now she's fighting the sister of the sinister flyweight champion. She's fighting Antonina Shevchenko. That one seems absolutely tailor-made to be very bad to watch. To just be 15 minutes of incredibly unattractive striking. So those are some of the fights we're going to be covering. There's a couple more on the undercard that we're going to try to get to as well. But there's interest in a lot of those for me, Phil. I don't know about you. I don't know how fun they're going to be, but I am kind of intrigued. Certainly in the main event. Woodley versus Burns, it's kind of fascinating. It's kind of intimidating as a matchup as well. They're both kind of weird styles. Gilbert Burns is a real, motley sort of, it's come together in, bits and bobs over the years. And Tyron Woodley's style is, of course, Tyron Woodley's style. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very strange one. I mean, we've, and I tend to share your thoughts on the card as a whole. I mean, these are pretty relevant fights, but I feel like they've chosen, because they don't like Tyron Woodley, I feel like they've kind of chosen to pack this card with fights which, sort of have to happen, but you just want to get them out of the way. This is a real plate of vegetables card.
Yeah.
Where, it just needs to be done.
It's one of those episodes of TV where it's just all really dull plot developments. It's like, well, we got to get the characters to point B, so yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, I don't think they think that either of these two guys would be their number one choices to get, for a welterweight title shot, but they have to do something with them. And
right.
And yeah, on that note, it's an interesting matchup because, we've never really been that high on Tyron Woodley, although we did pick him to beat Kamaru Usman, which was a bit of a mistake.
I didn't. No, you must be misremembering. You did.
Okay, fine. I did.
Yep.
I will let you live in your lying world for now.
I wouldn't have done that. That's silly. I wouldn't have done that.
Crazy talk.
Yeah.
But he is still a pretty dangerous fighter given the right style match in front of him.
Uh-huh.
And this is one of those cases where you're looking at the guy in front of him and you can say, Gilbert Burns has some of the elements of the people who can beat Tyron Woodley, but he is not someone who I feel can beat Tyron Woodley safely. Because I think if there's two things you pretty much need to be able to beat Tyron Woodley safely, it's an educated lead hand and pressure, or you just need to be incredibly good in the clinch.
Sure. I mean, even Kamaru Usman took some big shots from Woodley at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Ended up exchanging with him. It's never particularly safe. There's a reason that Tyron Woodley became champion. And held on to it with his incredibly frustrating style. It's just this really simple... His style is like us trying to break down this fight. You know what I mean? Like, the dynamic is very straightforward and simple, but, like, how exactly do you solve the problem? How exactly do I pick a fighter here? I don't know. I want to mention, before we get too far into anything, because I think this may be a factor impacting a lot of these fights... is that this is going to be the smaller cage. I'm not 100. Well, I know why, actually. I think in fact this backs up your theory, because we know the arena where this is taking place can hold the full sized octagon, especially with no fans in attendance. Shouldn't be a problem. I think they know this is like just a sort of getting through business sort of card. And so they're like, we may as well make these bad fights inherently more action-packed. And so they're going with the smaller cage, the 25-footer instead of the 30-foot one. So it's going to be UFC on WEC mode. That might favor Burns. But the trouble for me is that even if it forces more exchanges... Like, Gilbert Burns he's not Rory McDonald. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, maybe he can kind of approximate the pressure. He can certainly land, like, the low kicks. He can get in there with some decent punches, but he's not, like, a defensively great striker. He's got some moves in the clinch, but I'm not confident that it's really, like, that deep of a game. Maybe we can talk more about that. I just don't know. Like, it feels like I should pick Gilbert Burns, really just because I've lost a lot of like faith in Tyron Woodley, and I finally saw him lose. The thing is like Gilbert Burns has an awful lot of material to draw from to learn what to do and what not to do against Tyron Woodley, but so did all of the guys who fought Tyron Woodley after Rory McDonald easily beat him. And just most of them couldn't actually do it. I don't know. What are the key...
The basic issue here...
Go on, please.
We had some connection issues there. So I think the basic issue here is that Burns is and that he really has to step into close distance. Like, he's not a big, tall welterweight. He's a squat guy, and he tends to have to like jump into close distance, but he doesn't do so really behind a jab or anything like that. He tends to jump in behind a hook and behind hooks and overhands. Like, he doesn't make himself any longer, which means that he's got if he's fighting against Tyron Woodley, it means he's got basically a lot of distance to cover where he's not looking to get lit up by a right hand. And the other problem is, as you said, like, he's not particularly defensively responsible when he's doing that either.
Right.
So the people that he's been fighting recently have a lot of the time they've been guys that he can just he can take their shots and just bully them physically.
Yeah, for a guy who's found a new style moving up a weight class, he's really become like more of a tank. I guess it kind of makes sense. Well, no, it doesn't actually. Like you would expect this to be the case if he were now fighting smaller opponents because he got bullied a lot at lightweight. But he's just become, I guess, because he's filled out. It's the Dustin Poirier transition. Like he's just become. He feels more powerful, more durable, more confident in his ability to be aggressive. But that is kind of the story of his most recent fights, and I'm not sure, like how instructive is like that win over Gunnar Nelson. Like how well does that match up against any other styles in this division? Frankly, maybe it matches up okay with Tyron Woodley as an opponent. But they've just been kind of weird fights, haven't they? From Gilbert Burns, like he knocking out Damian Maia, who's old. Like there's an asterisk attached to each and every one. Gunnar Nelson is not, is certainly no longer in his prime, but still a good win. I don't know. It just feels to me that so far at welterweight, Gilbert Burns has been getting away with a lot. As you said, with like the leaping in with the big, fully loaded power shots. He also tends to lead with low kicks a lot.
Yes, seems like it wouldn't necessarily work great.
Yeah, he doesn't really feint. Like there's not a lot of trickery or like rhythm to his game. It's a relatively low pace. He's just kind of in there, just like being able to eat damage, and plugging away with his power shots. Which he throws.
I mean, I think the things that he's developed up at this weight class that he didn't necessarily have so much at lightweight, I think it's less physical strength and more is just durability and cardio. Because he's just confident. He's more confident that he can keep the pace, and he's more confident that he can take the shots.
Yeah.
But taking the shots is probably not really what you want to do against Tyron Woodley.
Right.
So I think at least from the Rory Mack side of things, I think it doesn't seem like it's at least, if not favorable. I mean, because, Woodley's style is very athletically dependent. He's been out for a while. He got absolutely dominated in his last fight.
Right.
It's worth considering that, like, he could just, he could just end up looking awful.
Sure.
So the Rory fight isn't really, but it's not really there for Burns. He's not that kind of guy.
Right.
I think an interesting one though is still, I think, the Marquardt fight, because the Marquardt fight was really the key to the Usman loss as well, right? Because it was the main thing about that fight was that Marquardt could just pick up the clinch whenever he wanted.
Yeah.
So I think the question with Burns is not necessarily can he pick Woodley off from the outside, but can he kind of just get into the clinch and fight Woodley on breaks?
Well, the question is more, will he do it? Because there really isn't a lot stopping anyone from getting to the clinch with Woodley. He doesn't have a jab. Mm-hmm. He just wants to time you with that right hand. And a lot of times the answer to that is, rather than like bunching up and jumping in, giving the opponent this big readable movement, to simply walk forward and grab onto them. That can negate a lot of that counter-punching timing. So yeah, that's why I find it hard though. Like, I have seen Burns comport himself fairly well in the clinch in some of these recent fights. I don't think I've actually really seen him like force it on anyone. Like a lot of the clinch work he had to do against Gunnar Nelson was reactive because Gunnar wanted to be in the clinches. I guess he grabs some opportunistically, but usually after punches. I don't really often see him just walk forward and try to grab onto someone, honestly. Can you recall any examples of that?
I mean, he obviously did, early in his UFC career, he was doing it against, like, Cowboy Oliveira, but he had a hell of a time.
Yeah.
Let me think.
I don't know. I think it usually seems like a second layer. Granted, that could still work, right? If he comes in here thinking, I'm going to start an exchange with the ultimate goal of grabbing onto Tyron Woodley, that would make sense.
Yep.
And certainly the smaller cage would seem to be worse for Tyron Woodley than it is for Gilbert Burns. Like, unless something is drastically different, which it may be.
I mean, but the thing is it because Woodley has such bad cagecraft? Like, I mean, Woodley
does it make a difference?
Literally deliberately puts himself into the cage, so it sort of doesn't make any difference to me.
Well, it does make the corners tighter. It gives you less real estate. Well, if you're already going to put yourself against the cage, you now have less real estate to move laterally.
Yeah, I guess so.
Although, not that he does a particularly great job.
Yeah,
of
he
that.
doesn't. Yeah, he doesn't really do that either. He just kind of sits there.
It's a weird fight. Like it is very difficult to figure out. I'm going to end up picking Gilbert Burns because of reasons that honestly feel really unpredictable to me. Like, he has been winning fights recently. I have some reason to believe that he's got some confidence going in here, that I know he's been active. Like, Tyron Woodley has been apparently writing and recording the worst rap songs ever conceived instead of doing much training. I don't know if you're aware, Phil, but Tyron Woodley is falling in and out of love with you. Repeat, times 90.
Yeah. What I really don't understand is that why he doesn't do any raps about, like, the interesting things about himself. Like, that he's a world champion cage fighter and that would be badass. Why instead does he make raps around, like, that are just about exactly the same subjects that, like, any other terrible rapper would be rapping about? I guess I shouldn't judge his art.
I think applying the word art was a judgment certainly that you should not have made. I don't know. Like, he's not a champion anymore. Maybe he doesn't want to bring it up. I don't know. Maybe that's another indication. I've been looking for all these little psychological indicators lately, Phil. Maybe Tyron Woodley is over MMA. You know? He's not really that proud of his accomplishments in this sport anymore. He doesn't really care. He doesn't want to talk to people or boast about it. Or maybe he has not incorrectly reasoned that anytime somebody who goes into music and starts writing songs about MMA, it's really bad. So, I mean, granted, his are bad too, but he tried something different.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's a tough question to answer. Just like this match.
At least they'd be bad and unique.
Yeah. That's true. I don't know. Tyron Woodley's rap career is much like this matchup, very difficult to actually parse. Like I said, I was ramping up to a Gilbert Burns pick. I don't know. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm gonna take Gilbert Burns, I guess.
Right.
I think there's still a big chance he gets his head taken off, but I think there's a few things. Woodley's never been quite as good at clonking orthodox fighters as he is southpaws. I think he really likes having the open stance line for his right hand.
Interesting.
Marquardt and so on. I think I like Burns over 5 rounds more. I think he can just keep a pace. He's a more attritional fighter. He's, he punches and kicks to the body. He kicks to the legs. And Woodley just isn't a great fighter over 5 rounds if he's forced to work.
Right.
If you give him a glacial Wonder Boy-esque pace, he's probably fine.
That might happen.
Yeah, I think Burns can survive the second of the threats of Woodley's game fairly handily.
Yeah.
I.e., he's not going to be particularly worried about getting blast doubled or out wrestled.
Yep.
And he can just keep up more activity. So I think
I highly doubt Woodley will
try.
I highly doubt Woodley will try to take him down, to be honest. Woodley is that kind of risk avoider in the cage. Like, he never tried to take Damian Maia down, even though he easily could have. Gilbert Burns isn't quite Damian Maia, but I think the dynamic is the same.
Yeah, exactly. I think Woodley just doesn't go for takedowns that much anyway because he's worried about he wants to conserve his gas tank.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think The Marquardt fight, I think that was at least partially Woodley, not having developed this style out. But I still think there are pieces of that there, and there's the other fight that's a bit like that is, of course, the Jake Shields fight. Mm-hmm. And I think Woodley and Marquardt and Jake Shields, Burns in aggregate holds enough of those to, I think, be able to duplicate a winnable matchup in those. Especially if it's over 5.
Yeah, maybe not second most likely outcome. By the way, maybe third most likely. But there is also a chance that Tyron Woodley comes in here with a bit of a gambit in mind and goes full Robbie Lawler mode.
Mm-hmm. It's I was thinking that as well.
One of those rare occasions where he's like, I'm going to immediately press forward and set up this right hand rather than waiting for it to materialize, and then just instantly knocks Gilbert Burns out.
Yeah, I think as a sort of very coached and tense counterpuncher, I think that's often, we've seen that dynamic play out with like Rashad Evans before, when he fought Rampage Jackson.
Yeah.
That, his natural style is incredibly conservative and focused on counterpunching, but he'd clearly told himself, I'm going to do one thing at the start of this fight. I'm just going to do one thing. I'm going to come out,
right,
and I'm going to absolutely clock Rampage in the face and take him down, and I'm going to do it immediately, and he did.
Yep.
I think that was the same with Woodley, Lawler, and to an extent Woodley, Till.
Oh, I agree. He just had a bit of a delayed start. Yeah, I don't know. Like Gunnar Nelson hit Gilbert Burns with a lot of lunging straight shots. And honestly, like, had he not been so committed to the clinch, where he's normally pretty good but couldn't actually out-wrestle Gilbert Burns, had he not been Gunnar Nelson, is what I'm saying, and had just a slightly lower or slightly higher output, that fight wouldn't have looked nearly as one-sided as it did. And Tyron Woodley's a bigger hitter than Gunnar Nelson, so he can afford to be at that low output and land the same straight shots and still have a really good shot of winning. It's just to reiterate, it's not an easy one to call. I'm picking Gilbert Burns, more consistent over 5 rounds. All the reasons you stated, I 100% agree. But I don't think either of us feels that good about it. But it is interesting.
I mean, you're still basically picking a short-armed person with bad defense to beat Tyron Woodley. So.
Right. But it's interesting. There's something there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to find out what the hell is going on with Woodley right now. So that, to me, is enough of a compelling question to get me to engage with this one. And that should be enough of a breakdown to end this first segment. When we come back, Blagoy Ivanov versus Augusto Sakai. Sort of a weirdly non-violent feeling heavyweight co-main event, but could still be a very interesting dynamic between those two. We're going to talk Mackenzie Dern versus Hannah Cifers, Caitlin Chookagian, Antonina Shevchenko, and if we have time, maybe get on to Tim Elliott and Louis Smolka versus Casey Kenny, some of the stuff from down on the undercard as well. All of that after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are moving on through the undercard of UFC Fight Night, whatever the fuck it is, Woodley versus Burns, and that means starting with the co-main event, a heavyweight bout. A particular kind of heavyweight bout. I think the standard heavyweight fight, Phil, is like 50%. Well, I'll put it this way: is like 25% thrilling because big knockout. 50% incredibly boring, and 25% incredibly boring up to the thrilling knockout. Like that 90% of heavyweight fights, I think, fall into that sort of category, fall into that breakdown. Then there's a slim minority of heavyweight fights that are kind of technical style boring, like the kind of fight that's boring, but when Joe Rogan watches it, he tells you that it's really good. And I think this is of that category because Blagoy Ivanov, he is a tricky fighter to look good against. He's a counterpuncher. He's a pretty rare counterpuncher, a pretty rare example of one in the heavyweight division. He's only really got like his right hook. He can't really throw like a combination of more than 2 or 3 punches in a row. Defense is not great. Footwork is just okay, but he's patient. He's got good timing, and he's very tough. So he makes for a pretty capable counterpuncher, and it is just difficult to get on to really get rolling against him for a lot of heavyweights, for most heavyweights, in fact. Augusto Sakai, on the other hand, is Phil. I think the phrase you and I came up with earlier together was I believe I said sort of a fatter Ruslan Magomedov. And I believe your addition to that was a much fatter Ruslan Magomedov. He is one of those heavyweights that just doesn't really have a lot of heavyweight power. Obviously, it is heavyweight. Everyone in this division can knock someone out, and Augusto Sakai did in his last fight. But most of the time, it's just like hard low kicks, good snappy but not devastating jabs, and just sort of like a pretty decent looking technique, but not a lot of output, very measured. It's that kind of heavyweight fight. Like you can see the dynamic materializing before your eyes, right?
Yeah. I mean, so this one is, I mean, it's not going to look pretty, like just physically, right? It's not going to be, it's not going to look like this is the pinnacle of combat sports we're seeing here. Uh-huh. These are some jiggly men, but they are men with some fairly remarkable, like heavyweight traits in their favor. Yeah, I mean, Sakai is, I would say Sakai is probably one of the more interesting heavyweights to watch at the moment. He's in terms of like the technical quality of his approach. He can feint, he can jab, he can take he can take steam off his punches in order to set up his shots. Yeah, he's a good low kicker, he's a decent grappler. He's a good, like, he's a surprisingly good, entertaining, like, technical fighter for this division. I mean, he's sort of I guess he might be the Leon Edwards of this division, let's say.
I think that's very fair, actually. And he seems really big and strong, like classic heavyweight material, but there is a lot more subtlety to his actual technical game than the vast majority of the division.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Ivanov is, just inhumanly tough, is the main thing which makes his game work, I think. Because he is basically, as you said, he's a counterpuncher, and he's basically kind of a catch and pitch counterpuncher if the catching glove was on his face. Because
it's a tried and true method.
When you punch him, he will hit you back. And he is, borderline immortally tough.
Yeah. Couldn't get knocked out by Derek Lewis. Couldn't get knocked out by... He fought Junior Dos Santos too, right? Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, it was 5 rounds of him mostly getting beaten up.
Uh-huh. So...
And, he's never been knocked out.
Is that true? Never once?
I don't think so. He got submitted by Volkov.
That means something at heavyweight. Like a lot of times, it always means something when someone's never been knocked out, but for almost any period of time, that is meaningful at heavyweight. He's only taken 3 losses. And it's been Volkov, JDS, and Derek Lewis. Mm-hmm. Granted, I don't know how great most of the wins are, but it's heavyweight. Like, you work with what's given you.
Yeah, so that's what that's sort of what we were getting at with this booking, is that these are actually pretty uncommon guys, despite how much they look like they are generic heavyweights.
Right.
both of them would be very, very tough fights for almost anyone in this division. But that being said, I do favor Sakai.
Yeah.
Because he's just more skillful. A lot of what we saw from Ivanov against Rothwell, this is all stuff that Sakai can, I think, probably do a bit better than Rothwell. Because this was Rothwell he was sort of doing what Sakai did against
Orlovsky?
Tibera.
Oh, yeah.
Tibera, because the shot that hurt Tibera was basically the first hard shot that Sakai had thrown, because the whole rest of everything else he'd thrown up against them was just probing volume.
Mm-hmm.
And it meant that, Tibera wasn't sure when to fire back. And similarly, Rothwell has that kind of handsy, ghetto foreman-esque style where he's going to be, holding his hands out and then just punching the last foot or so to get people moving out of position. So I think, and obviously Sakai has much better defense than Rothwell does.
Absolutely, especially this version of Ben Rothwell.
Yeah, and the other element is that if he gets Ivanov circling around the cage as he is wont to do, I think Sakai can just kick his legs.
Yeah, I mean, that is one thing I think to Sakai's credit is that despite being, I think a lot of the quote-unquote technical heavyweights we see, they're like Luke Rockholds. They sort of develop that style in response to what they get from a lot of heavyweights, which on the regional circuit is big dumb brutes who walk forward but can't cut off the cage. And Sakai is not that. He's very, very willing to pressure, which I think is an excellent sign for him here. That he'll probably be able to force the action. I'm glad you pointed out his defense. By heavyweight standards, it's actually quite good. Which I don't mean to say that it's great or all that deep, but he does move his head after he strikes pretty consistently. He'll move his head and his feet in conjunction with each other pretty consistently. And he's fairly not cautious. He's fairly, careful about managing his distance. He doesn't tend to do an awful lot of lunging. There's still some. But yeah, he's a pretty well put together defensive fighter. So I think pressure is going to work fairly well, drawing out Ivanov's counters and perhaps recountering them. And in the meantime, just getting to chop at his legs while he's moving backwards. But I don't know. Ivanov is very tough, and other than Marcin Tybura, who's not had a particularly good-looking run of it lately, Sakai, we could talk about Ivanov never being knocked out, but on the other hand, Sakai is basically never finished anyone. That really means a whole lot. Unless we're talking about the Thiago Cardosos of the world, he's never gotten more than one really meaningful finish over a notably durable fighter. So
you're not giving credence to that incredible win over Chase the Vanilla Gorilla Sherman?
Oh, I forgot he did TKO Chase Sherman in the third round. Basically just because Chase Sherman couldn't get up. But I'll give some credence to that. You're right to bring that up. That is a very impressive display of punching power. Mike Russo-esque punching power even. But so if somebody gets knocked out in this fight, again, not saying that Sakai can't do it, but it's likelier to be him than Ivanov, who gets floored. And I can see Ivanov actually getting those right hands in. I can see him just accepting exchanges. He's got the counter-punching thing, but he's I want to reiterate, he's very, very tough. The dude traded with Derek Lewis, willingly exchanged punches with him back and forth. He will stand strong and throw down with Sakai, no doubt. And if it reaches that point, is that not a good enough answer to the kind of sort of measured pressure Sakai brings? To at least get some good shots in? Probably. I'm going to be picking Sakai. I think he's going to be coming forward more often. I think he's going to get lots of opportunities as a result to land his powerful kicks and keep Ivanov, the smaller fighter, here on the end of his jab. But he's just not that intimidating. It could end up being like I don't know, we were just talking about Gilbert Burns before. It could be like Gilbert Burns' fight with Alexei Kunchenko. He just doesn't have to worry about these quick flurrying hands. He can just step in and land thudding shots. And I think Ivanov is capable.
The other thing to mention though is that Ivanov doesn't have great power for a heavyweight either.
No. He certainly doesn't. But I don't really have a great idea of how good Sakai's chin is yet.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
He hasn't, to his credit, I haven't seen him eating a lot of shots in the UFC. Against Andrei Arlovsky, for example, who, like Ivanov, only had one punch, arguably a slightly less tricky one and a slower one at this point than Ivanov's southpaw right hook. But Sakai did a really good job of basically getting out of the way of it every time. So that is to his credit, and that might just be the answer, that Ivanov is going to try to create those exchanges when it becomes clear that he needs to, and Sakai just doesn't have to. But, yeah, that's a fair point. So Sakai just feels like the compulsory pick, basically. You agree with that?
Yep, pretty much got to pick him.
Okay. Let's talk real quickly then about Mackenzie Dern and Hannah Cifers. This is like a one-sided matchup in my mind. And I feel bad saying that, because I like Hannah Cifers. I think she seems like a charming, earnest person. I like her sort of gritty fighting style. She's a technician, with the hands. She's still very raw, she's coming along and she's developing this style. It almost reminds me of an early Drew Dober kind of game. And I think she has potential, but she just got out-grappled and beaten up on the ground by Angela Hill in her last fight. And that does not portend well to what's going to happen in this matchup. Now, I don't know how seriously Mackenzie Dern is taking any of this. I don't know how she will respond to being just summarily picked apart by Amanda Hebush, but she didn't break in that fight. She did actually manage to show some real fighter toughness and continually push for the win. And as was the case in all of her UFC fights before Amanda Hebush, I think that just being bigger and being determined to push forward and keep the fight happening is going to almost incidentally be enough for her to get Cifers down and strangle her.
Yeah, pretty much. So we've seen both Angela Hill and Macy Barber just clobber Cifers from top.
Yep.
She's just too small at the moment, and she's trying to fight a technical boxing game against people who are way bigger than her, and she has her margins for error are really small.
Yeah.
She has to be she's pretty technical. She has to be really technical to make this work, because she's up against just major strength, speed, and size disadvantages half the time.
Honestly,
Mackenzie Dern is huge and possibly going to miss weight because that's what she does.
Yeah.
And just is happy to leverage a physical advantage in kind of the same way that Macy Barber is. She might.
Yeah.
She's one of those people where she might start the fight out trying to be technical and flex some new skill set, but as you said, Dern is a competitor. Mm-hmm. If stuff starts going badly for her, she will just try and force it.
Yep. It's a good trait to have, honestly.
I think that will work.
Yeah. I found it encouraging in her loss to Hebush. Hopefully I would love to see Dern come in here and show off some major technical improvements. I would not even be upset if I saw Dern come in and look worse in a way that suggests she is working on technical improvements, because sometimes that happens. Yeah. I would like to see her taking some lessons away from that loss to Hebush, because Hebush showed up. She looked absolutely phenomenal. She looked so professional and well prepared, but it wasn't the woman we were expecting to reveal all these problems, but they were problems that were going to be revealed in Dern's game. So hopefully she started to address them. that would add like some more meaning, I guess, to this matchup, which, as we said at the top, is one of those fights that it sort of has to happen. Like, I get why it's happening. It's just, there's really no way to call it for Cifers. And what I was going to say before is that I would really, honestly, Cifers is 27. Part of me just like wants to see her lose, and then she could go to Invicta. Like, she's still fairly young. She's still fairly inexperienced. I think she's got potential. I'd like to see her get a few more forgiving matchups, maybe for another year or two, and then maybe come back to the UFC. But currently the size disadvantage is she's not doing herself any favors, still being as underdeveloped as she is as a tiny 115er. So let's take one more break. When we come back, we've got, let's see, oh God, Chookagian, Shevchenko, the other one. It's not, you can't say Chookagian, Shevchenko 2. It's Chookagian, Shevchenko 2.0. This indicating that it is the second model of Shevchenko's sister. That, I don't know, whatever car manufacturer there is in the plains of Kyrgyzstan has started to crank out. This is the other Shevchenko they make. And also Casey Kenny versus Louis Smolka, which is kind of lit. Now that I think about it, we're going to talk about those two after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, well, here we go. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. And we couldn't be avoided any longer. We're talking about accursed Shevchenko's sister. The Panther? That's her nickname? Ugh. Disgusting. Actually, I thought it was El Pantera, wasn't it? Which is even worse. Pantera's a great band. And Anthony Shevchenko, the bastard, is besmirching their image. She's going to get knocked out by Kayla Chookagian, Phil. Chookagian's going to tear her head off. I'm going to love every second of it. Would you say she's going to get slaughtered? Are you far beyond driven to pick against her? Are you looking at a Wikipedia page of Pantera track listings? Or do you just know these songs? I just know these songs. Ooh, maybe we should did an entire. I once did an entire preview. I did a preview for Yaya Rodriguez, where I did an entire paragraph. Oh my! Which was just Pantera songs. Well, I've never loved you so much. You could even say that my admiration for you has reached a new level. Hell yeah. Yeah, so, sorry, before I indulge in a vulgar display of Pantera references, I don't know. Break down this fight. You do it. I don't wanna. Okay, so Shevchenko, Antonina appears to be the, less athletic version of her sister, but honestly, as we were discussing before we started recording, she is in fact just worse as well. Yeah. She is a, bolt upright, arm punching, piston punching, stand there person, whereas Valentina is a remarkably good defensive fighter. Has to be said, one of the best in women's mixed martial arts, if not the best. Look, I have my jokes. I've never been shy about praising the actual technical gifts of Valentina Shevchenko. There's no denying she's a very good fighter. There's also no denying she's a bad person. But please, go on. Yeah, so Antonina sort of fights a bit like her in the most broad brush way, in that she's fairly defensive and wants to keep at range, but she just doesn't have Valentina's grasp on distance or, her defense, which just puts her into
ugly exchanges and means that she kind of has to be at a significant reach advantage or just be up against someone who's scared of her power. Yeah. I mean, she got fairly effectively pressured and shut down by Roxanne Modafferi.
Right.
And, which also showed that she doesn't have the defensive, she doesn't have the grappling of her sister either. So, I mean, I tend to favor Caitlin. I tend to favor Chookagian, basically. I think there were a lot of points on the feet where she was fighting Roxy, where you could just say that Shevchenko would have done this against Chookagian as well, in that she's just, she stands there and just punches. And Chookagian at least keeps a good pace. She comes in behind throwaway volume. Like, she kicks. I don't think either of these women are going to be hurting each other particularly badly. But, yeah, if you're getting outpaced and outvolumed by Roxanne Modafferi, I don't really see why you wouldn't also get outpaced and volumed by Caitlin Chookagian.
Yeah. Chookagian's loss to the sister was really just it was just a matter of levels to a certain degree. I think I may have said this at the time before the fight, but it was basically the same dynamic as Valentina's fight with Holly Holm years ago, which is one of the few Valentina Shevchenko fights I have always admitted to enjoying. I think it is actually one of those fairly slow, fairly low output, quote unquote technical fights that is genuinely engaging to watch Shevchenko coming up with solutions to the problem of Holly Holm, who sort of like Dominic Cruz against Cody Garbrandt responds to the first few moments of difficulty by just more and more insistently charging forward. And so watching Shevchenko sort of build the counterattack over the course of the fight, I really enjoy. And Caitlin Chookagian against Valentina in her last fight basically looked like a smaller and markedly less durable Holly Holm, which isn't a slight against Chookagian's durability. Holly Holm is an incredibly durable fighter, as we know. So I guess one way to look at this matchup to try and figure it out would be to say, would Antonina Shevchenko beat Holly Holm? And I think the answer is no. I think it's a pretty resounding no, in fact. And I don't think Holly Holm's chin would be the key thing that would save her in that fight. I think the volume, the aggression, which Chookagian actually probably got smoked by Valentina the way she did because she has really upped her aggression of late. Had she been the old Caitlin Chookagian, she probably would have lost a really horrendous decision. But she has now reached that home level of being willing to maintain the pace on the opponent, to actually make them deal with the pace if they fight a little more reticently. So, I don't think Holly Holm would beat Antonina Shevchenko. Or rather, I don't think Antonina Shevchenko would beat Holly Holm. Therefore, I don't think she's going to beat Caitlin Chookagian.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's going to be close. For one real reason, and that's that Shevchenko. I described her as a puncher. She is a puncher. She hits hard. Mm-hmm. And if she can sit down on her shots, I think she hits much harder than Chookagian does. She's got if she's just static, then she has a very nice 3-2. I think, for example.
Sure, but she's also hardly knocked anyone out because turning that power into a knockout, knocking someone out and having power are not one and the same.
Yeah, so I think we probably get a sort of power versus volume dynamic, where Chookagian's going to land more and Shevchenko's going to land harder. And yeah, I probably slightly favor Chookagian. I mean, she tends to win close decisions anyway.
Right.
She's pretty good at it. I mean, she's active and noisy. So yeah, I'd take her. But I think we might end up with a split or something.
She's actually lost 2 of her 3 split decisions in the UFC.
Oh, really?
I know, you wouldn't think that, right? I mean, she has had a lot of other decisions, some other ones that were close that didn't go to split. But yeah, both Carmouche and I beat her on split decision. interestingly. I tend to agree, though. Yeah, I don't know. Chookagian has had that dynamic before. She has faced it plenty of times before. I'm not sure if Shevchenko has dealt with, like, other than Roxy, again, which is a pretty strong example of how much trouble she could have dealing with just a high-output fighter. Chookagian is a better high-output striker than Roxy. So that's more than enough for me to pick her. And boy, do I feel good doing it, Phil. Such a sense of power, control. The world is mine. Okay, there is one more fight here to be discussed. We'll try to get through it pretty quickly. But it's Casey Kenny versus Louis Smolka at 135. Louis Smolka's second or third fight of this division. I'm trying to remember. Second, right? The Matt Schnell fight was at flyweight, or was it at bantamweight?
I thought it was a bantamweight.
Yeah, I think you might be right, actually. Okay, so I think this is his third. Or actually possibly his fourth bantamweight fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sue Mudaerji was the...
Mudaerji, yeah.
That was the bantamweight debut. Boy, they fly by, don't they? The fourth fight of Louis Smolka's at bantamweight versus a guy that I have really come to like and admire. It's not unusual these days in the UFC to just see some random name. Usually it is a name very much like Casey Kenny, too. You're just like, this guy was named after some TV show that I've never watched in some Midwestern U.S. small town, and he probably wrestled a little, and I don't care. And you see a million of these guys on every, nondescript fight night card now. And I thought that was Casey Kenny when he came in and got matched against Ray Borg. And he fought very impressively. And even more impressively, I thought, in the fight against Manny Bermudez, who had some really big physical advantages over Casey Kenny. And, he had to fight his heart out in that fight. It was a very Frankie Edgar-esque performance. And, complete with the fact that Kenny, because he doesn't cut weight, has great stamina, but is much smaller than many of his opponents. I thought he comported himself spectacularly. I still enjoyed his fight with Merab Dvalishvili. I think that might be basically a physical limit for him, someone that strong and beefy. But Louis Smolka is not Merab Dvalishvili. He is, until relatively recently, a flyweight, a tall one, but very lanky, not really noted for his physical strength. So my gut feeling going into this is that I favor Kenny. But I want to hear your thoughts, Phil.
Yeah, it's a strange one because, when you look back at Smolka's career, he did have a modest amount of hype, but when you look back at his record and the people he's beaten,
yeah,
there's not really many people you would put in there as being any kind of physical threat whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, there's Ben Nguyen is a pretty good puncher.
Yeah, there's Ben Nguyen as the obvious outlier, but everyone else is pretty much bottom of the barrel as far as you go for flyweight. Ben Nguyen is, to be fair, near the top. He's as far as pure athleticism goes, he's an incredible fighter, but he's also a really bad grappler.
I'll give
or it's not.
They're very specialized,
Sorry,
They're very specialized, or they're very limited in one way or another. I won't say this 4-fight win streak here, I gotta defend, is pretty good. Like, Paddy Holohan, if you're gonna engage him in a grappling battle, which Louis Smolka did, that's a credible win, I think. It shows the level of his grappling skill. And Neil Seery, yeah, I think the phrase he used just before was not dangerous, which I would more or less agree with. But he's a tough guy to look good against. He's very, very scrappy, Neil Seery.
Yeah.
So those are 3 really solid wins, in my opinion. But yeah, the rest of the, even those, it is kind of hard to put yourself back in the mindset of why were we so hyped about Louis Smolka before he lost 4 fights in a row.
Yeah, because he is one of those guys, a bit like he is one of these guys where he's not athletic, but he is, for whatever reason, he is dynamic. He is able to finish people off, but he's neither quick or particularly powerful or particularly durable.
Mm-hmm.
And that has, I think, got him fairly far. And he has a lot of elements to his game as well, which means that he's not necessarily particularly easy to scout. Like that Neil Siri fight, for example. I mean, that was a really good example of him kind of feinting and working boxing combinations up top and then changing levels to take Siri down, which, isn't easy to do when you have that kind of height disparity. It was helped by Siri being a pretty slow flyweight, but it was still impressive. And, he's decent in the clinch. He's a very strange, noodly grappler, which sometimes has worked against him, to be honest.
He's a very strange, noodly everything.
Yeah. But yeah, there is just there's a physical edge there that Casey Kenny clearly is going to have in this fight.
Yeah.
And we've seen that Smolka on the ground is constantly just turning and looking for submissions. He is constantly fighting from his back, and he is never getting back to his feet.
Yep.
He's one of these guys. He will just play guard forever.
And Kenny is one of those guys who consistently turns his opponent's attempts to hunt the submission against them. He's very calm and a good scrambler.
Yeah, exactly. So I think of this as being as the analogs, it would be a slightly worse Frankie Edgar against a much worse Charles Oliveira. If your top control is good enough, then it's perfectly possible just to put Smolka into ground positions until he breaks.
Yeah.
And Casey Kenny was not only able to hold his own in the wrestling against Ray Borg, which was, impressive enough, but, Borg is historically a flyweight and hasn't really translated up to bantamweight. But it was the fact that he was able to scramble with him so well.
Yeah. That Ray Borg jumped on his back about a dozen times. And a couple times came pretty close to sinking in the choke, and each time Kenny, like I said, stayed very calm and turned every one of those attempts into an opportunity to get on top. So, yeah, that's a very good dynamic for Kenny, I think. I'll say this for Smolka as a striker, he might be able to do something with what. In fact, I think he will be able to do something with what we saw out of Manny Bermudez against Casey Kenny. Just having the reach is going to be a big factor. And Smolka, Bermudez is just a right hand. He really is just a right hand. He's a bantamweight Andrei Arlovsky. He's so dedicated to landing the right hand, and it's a hard one, and it's fast. But Kenny got a read on that eventually. It gave him trouble. The reach gave him trouble, and the pressure gave him trouble. But he got a read on it eventually. Smolka is much, much slower and much less damaging, but he is way, way more diverse. And I want to say sort of, like I said, he's a weird noodly everything, but he does kind of feel more natural as a striker than someone like Manny Bermudez.
Oh yeah.
We've seen it get better too. We've seen Louis Smolka, even going back to that, what feels in retrospect like a really one-sided loss to Matthews Nicolau. It really wasn't. The power difference and the technique, certainly the difference in defensive skill told in that fight. But if you watch it moment by moment, Louis Smolka gets in a lot of shots, and he is constantly trying to counter and throw back and put combinations together. He's constantly trying to work the body. He's got this sort of weird rhythm that I think could sucker, and has suckered a lot of worse fighters into sort of exchanges with him that they don't feel are dangerous. And then in that Ryan McDonald fight, he actually, McDonald, I think, is one of the worst fighters on the UFC roster. No shade. I just think he's not very good. But Smolka did manage to hurt McDonald and hit him to the body a ton, and showed, when given some sort of momentum on the feet, how creative his striking can be. So there's something there. But Kenny turned the fight with Bermudez. He initiated, to my recollection, he initiated a lot of the wrestling exchanges, and I don't think there's anything about Smolka that's going to stop him from getting in on singles or getting in on the body lock more and more as the fight goes on. So that looks like a Casey Kenny win to me but it should be fun. I mean, I like both these guys a lot, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the real kicker for this one, is that there's a lot of these fights where they could actually be pretty dull. I think Woodley Burns is probably going to be pretty good just because of Gilbert Burns. He'll either get himself knocked out or he'll force something to happen. But it's really notable that he spent a lot of time actually not doing all that much against Gunnar Nelson. He was pretty cautious.
Yeah.
And if he's given 5 rounds, we might get a lot of dead space there.
Yeah.
But this fight, I find it very hard to see this fight being boring. At least unless, Smolka is out of shape or gets tired and just gets sort of out-wrestled going down the stretch. But, he's a hyper-aggressive submission guy. He's going to throw a ton of strikes on the feet, and Kenny is probably going to, and the scrambling should be great. I mean, I think this is probably the action fight of the card.
I agree, yeah. And Kenny's going to throw hands, too. He does have some boxing, and he throws hard. He commits when he exchanges with people, so I agree. I think... I mean, like I said, I like both these guys. Casey Kenny has not had a dull fight yet. Has Louis Smolka ever had a dull fight? They're frequently weird, but they're usually very dynamic and very exciting. He's a pathologically aggressive guy and super tough. So I think it's going to be great. I think just realized now, reaching the end of this episode, that I'm more excited for that fight than anything else on this card. I actually really...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I really want to see it now that we've discussed it. All right, so that is UFC Fight Night Woodley versus Burns. And it's okay. A lot of it might not actually be fun, but listeners of the show will know from past experience that I'm often very forgiving towards cards that are not high on entertainment value, if they are still high on relevance and meaning. I care about the narratives. I want to see these characters and these plot lines continue to develop, things continue to move and change. And it may not be an exciting episode, but things will be moving and changing on this card. And that's kind of enough for me. Next week, as I teased at the top of the show, we savagely mocked UFC 250, as I recall, for having absolutely nothing lined up for it. Now that we look at it, Phil, I believe you were saying before you kind of love this card.
Yeah. All you need to do to make me love cards is just add top-ranked bantamweights to it.
Yeah, add 2 bantamweight fights, and the card becomes massively better than it was. And this has Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen, which is one of a division which is tailor-made for just you can throw a dart at the bantamweight rankings and make a great fight. I think that is one of the more interesting ones possible. So I'm super hyped about that. We'll be talking to you guys about that next week. We'll be talking to you about Nunes versus Spencer, which the obvious narrative has been Amanda Nunes. I don't know. I might point out that, Felicia Spencer has a really focused sort of game, and I don't know. Might be able to do something interesting in that fight. I'm curious to see it. And Ian Heinisch versus Gerald Meerschaert. What's not to like, baby? That's a middleweight classic in the making right there. So we'll be talking to you about all of that next week. Until then, Phil, I'm going to, before I ask you if you have anything coming out in preview form, I'm going to take the liberty of telling people that, excuse me, the words stick in my throat, but I have to push forward. You have a new piece out on Bloody Elbow called Connective Tissues in Pandemic UFC, which you had mentioned on past episodes. You want to tell people what that's about?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think we've mentioned the dynamic on the show a couple of times, and I've said I would like to write about it. Essentially how the sort of the empty arena UFC, weirdly, coincidentally, gave us these 3 main events in Ferguson Gaethje and Teixeira Smith and Harris Overeem that seemed almost guaranteed to amplify the sort of lonely and brutal dynamics of the way you could hear every strike and the way you could you could hear the breathing and the corners and so on.
Yeah.
and that the way that basically the organization I think has wanted to catch on as the only people putting on major sporting events in the United States, but in a way that the sport itself has put out its most honest face for this for this little moment. So yeah, I like writing it. It's been the first sort of independent piece I've written for a while. It hasn't been like a preview or staff picks, and yeah, so check it out.
Is it still a gladiatorial contest when you take away the arena and the two dudes just like fight in a quiet alley? That's the feeling that we have to grapple with. Do you also talk in there about the fact that we have seen surprisingly good technically improved performances from a lot of fighters as well?
I was thinking about it, but in the end, I thought I'd just keep it focused.
Like, let's just be pessimistic. Come on, you gotta give the people what they.
I just thought I'd just deliver a nice concentrated shot of downer.
All right. Well, I presume you have a preview coming out with Dave Castillo as well for this Woodley versus Burns card.
Do indeed.
People should check that out on bloodyelbow.com. And my own work, of which you may have noticed if you've been looking for things. I've not produced anything in a little while. There will be something coming. I'm working on a sort of broader article about left hooks at the moment. Of course, I celebrated Justin Gaethje's the week before last. And we also talked about Edson Barboza's nice left hook. We saw a lot of good left hooks the last week, and maybe we'll see one this weekend as well that will add more material for the sort of looking at this one technique from various angles. Anyway, you can find all of that stuff on bloodyelbow.com. You can find both Phil and myself on Twitter. Phil is at EvilGregJackson, and myself at BoxingBush, B-U-S-C-H. You should check out our Patreon. We had a bonus episode with Danny Martin that I thought was fantastic. It's always great to have him on the show. And that's the latest thing I think we published on the Patreon. There should be something else coming this week or weekend as well. So $3 a month to get access to all of our bonus episodes and whatnot. And until next week, thank you all so much for listening. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.
You know that, like, Cody Garbrandt is gonna spark Rafael Assunção the fuck out and then jump over everyone else in line, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I felt it when I looked at the matchup. My long eye, Phil. It saw the future.
Mm-hmm.